Good morning, and thank you for coming to our orchid class today. I'm Joyce, and this is Matt. Matt is going to be your leader today, and I just wanted to do a quick intro. We do have some handouts for those of you who are watching this live on Facebook. If you put your email address in the comments, we will email you copies of the handouts after the class is over. And if you have any questions, we will try to answer those at the end of the class as best we can. And with that, I'm going to turn the class over to Matt.
All right, thank you, Joyce. And thank you for everybody coming today. My name's Matt, and we're going to be talking about orchids. Do any of y'all currently have any orchids at the moment? Okay, good. Well, the orchids we're going to be talking about today are more of the uncommon ones, more of the ones that you probably haven't seen before. One of the coolest things about orchids is that they are the largest family of flowering plants. There's around 330,000 different species and around 200,000 different hybrids. So that's kind of what makes them probably one of the most popular houseplants, is there's just the variety that they have. Now, some of the ones we're going to be discussing today are ones that you're not going to see at most other places, but they're unique and they're really interesting. So my favorite one of the ones we have up here are going to be the Oncidiums. Are considered they're considered a more cooler growing orchid. They're able to tolerate longer dry spells, and they like temperatures in the 80 to 90 degree range. And they're an orchid that takes a lot more light than most orchids. So that's why I like those ones, because sometimes it's hard finding low light situations for my plants. Let's do the Cymbidiums and the Dendrobiums, these ones right here. These ones are considered a warmer climate orchid. Their average temperature range is anywhere from 55 to 70. And mainly what they're concerned with is good air circulation and plenty of moisture, consistent moisture, but good air circulation around their roots. Is kind of what they like. One thing I forgot to mention in starting is that most orchids are epiphytic, meaning that the way they grow is not in dirt. They generally attach themselves to trees and things like that, and they get their nutrients through aerial roots, basically. So most orchids, there are some terrestrial type orchids as well, but most orchids you're not going to be planting in dirt at all. The next one up is going to be the Oncidiums, I believe is how you say that. These are going to be these kind right here. These are considered high altitude orchids. So they grow in like clouded forest areas. Their temperatures are going to be a little bit lower for that area, for that reason. So 80 to 70 degrees is kind of what they like. And they like a high humidity with filtered light. So if you're going off light, these ones are going to take the most light. These ones are going to kind of be your second option. And then these are going to be your third option for light options. Okay, so some just general tips on kind of knowing what your orchid would want just based off of looking at them and not knowing much about them. The first thing is, if you see leathery type leaves like this and few leaves, it's generally an indication that it's going to want higher light. If you see, let's say like floppy type leaves, like the kind that you see in like big box stores, those type of leaves that are floppy, not rigid, that's generally going to mean that they want lower types of light. And then other things to kind of notice in orchids is if you see ones that have what these are called are pseudobulbs right here. That's an indication that this orchid can handle dry periods longer because it's storing water in this thing right here. And also kind of a good indication to know when an orchid like this needs water is if these are at any time wrinkly, that means that this can be refilled with water. This can hold more water, is what that's saying. Whereas orchids that don't have that just have leaves and stuff like that, this is going to need more consistent moisture. It doesn't have a way of really storing water, so you have to be more conscientious about that watering needs. Okay, so in general, like I mentioned, most orchids are going to be epiphytic. So when it comes to the type of soil that they need, you're never going to be using potting soil. The best thing to do is just to go out and get an orchid mix if you can. It's the easiest thing. It's going to be exactly what the orchids need most of the time. If you want to make your own though, really the two ingredients that you need to be using are fir bark and sphagnum moss. With those two ingredients, you can just about house any type of orchid. And anything besides that is somewhat unnecessary. When it comes to repotting an orchid, anytime you're going to repot an orchid, it's going to stress it out. There's no way to avoid that. And most orchids don't really like to be repotted at all. It's only kind of recommended that you repot an orchid about every 2 years. And the reason you're going to be doing it every 2 years is not for the root, the root health or anything like that. It's more so that over those 2 years, in moss or whatever medium you're growing in, it's going to build up salts and whatnot from the fertilizers that you use. Then also over in that 2-year period, that's usually the time about when like that start to break down. And when that stuff starts to break down, it's harder for the it can become more compact, and it's harder for the roots to to get that air and proper airflow and moisture that they need. So it's recommended repot it 2 years if you notice that your medium's not kind of holding up like it used to. And if you are going to repot it, it's best to do it when it's not blooming, more kind of in a dormant type period, because repotting it during a bloom can kind of stress it out and make the blooms fall off in some cases. When it comes to what you should be like potting the orchids in, you always want to go with an orchid type pot if you can, or just really anything that has good air circulation and good airflow all throughout the root ball. When it comes to watering, a general rule is you're going to want to water about once a week for most orchids during the growing season. If we're in a non-growing season, you can cut that to usually about once a month. The easiest way to kill orchids, though, is by letting them sit in water for too long. That's usually how most people end up killing their orchids. They let them sit in a thing of water, thinking that it'll just, whenever it needs water, it'll suck it up from the bottom. It's generally best to give your orchid a heavy dose of water, like a good rinse, a good soak, and then let it dry out completely before doing that again, rather than just setting it in a bucket of water or in a cup of water. Some common myths that people like to do when watering orchids is they like to maybe put an ice cube on it and say, that's enough water. It's really not. And orchids, they don't like cold water either. The best thing to do is to give them just a room temperature water. The ice cube method it's not enough water to feed the orchid, and it's a little bit too cold. So it's not really recommended way of watering. Most orchids are going to like a pretty high humidity, anywhere from 60 to 80%. We don't generally have that in our homes. So ways to kind of combat that would be you could use a humidifier next to your orchids if you're noticing that they're having problems with humidity. What I like to do is I'll get a tray, like a cooking tray, put gravel or rocks on the bottom, and then fill that with water, and then set my orchids on top of that. And that way, as the water evaporates, it's creating humidity kind of just in that little tray area and raising the humidity a little bit in my home. And you can also mist. You can also mist the orchids as well too. That's okay to do to kind of raise the humidity. When it comes to fertilizing, like I said, it's going to be once a month. You're going to want to use. Generally, you kind of just want to use an orchid-based fertilizer.
Water should you give if you give them once a month? Once a week.
Once a week. It's going to be dependent on the orchid, and I'll kind of go over which the different ways to water. But let's say if we're doing an Oncidium one, I do it till when I stick my finger in the medium, and if I'm in there at least 2 inches, I still want it to feel moist. So I consider it just a good soaking is what I would say. And then I don't do that again until this is completely dry. On just about any orchid, eventually at some point you're going to have roots coming out the top and out the bottom. It is completely fine. If like, let's say aesthetically you don't like it, it is okay to trim them up a little. You don't want to be trimming up a whole lot though, because that is where they get all their nutrients from. But yeah, it is completely fine. And one thing you want to be watching for in the roots is that's kind of how you can tell the health of your orchid as well. That's why a lot of times people like to grow them in clear plastic cups. A lot of times the roots will change color when they need more water. It'll be more of a, I think it's more of like a silver gray when they're needing water. And then once they're actually, once they have enough water, they'll be more of like a greenish color, the roots will. Also, you'll notice if you start to see browning in your roots, that means it's probably getting a little bit too much water, or it's holding on to too much water, because that means the roots are starting to rot, is what that means. Are there any other questions?
The holes in the bottom of the plant help for the aeration of the roots.
These right here? Yes, that's exactly what they're for. And anytime you see a pot like this, it's going to be considered strictly an orchid pot, just for that reason. If you can't find these, or you want to use something else, what I've seen in the past is people using plastic cups and just poking holes in that. Something as simple as that'll work too.
And then you should just wait and see if it's going to come back.
It will come back. Or sometimes they can flower from the spent bloom. All of these kind, once this is spent, you're going to want to cut it back. Even in the big boxwood kinds, I cut mine back too. The way to get them to bloom is more so from the light requirements and the temperature rather than anything else. And you really can only get them to bloom about once or twice a year. So once all the flowers have fallen off on those kind, cut off the stalk, and you're trying to get it. I don't know the exact temperature, but during the winter season, it's kind of put out buds again, and you're wanting to get it in a certain nighttime temperature, and then that combined with the amount of light is what's going to create more blooms for the next season, more so than anything that has to do with the old stalk. And you can leave the old stalk on there. Sometimes they'll produce, I think, what they're called kikis or something like that, where they make almost a baby plant on the stalk, especially in the big boxwood kinds. That's very common for them to do. But besides that, that's kind of the only reason why I would ever leave it on there, is if you're wanting to see if it can make little babies on that thing. Any other questions?
The bulb, so when it's storing the water, just always dehydrate.
It's always, okay.
Once a month. I mean, not once a week.
So I'm new to growing these as well. I have that problem with one of them, and I don't really know how to correct it. What I've noticed though is the new bulbs that it's putting out are healthy and not wrinkly, whereas the old ones are. So I think it's just an issue of getting that watering down consistently, and then over time, as it's starting to get used to your watering habits, it's going to start producing bulbs that actually look like this rather than kind of a wrinkly one like this. But it is, even if they are wrinkly, it's not a sign that the plant's dying. It can still grow like that. It's a sign that it's needing more water somehow.
All right.
Well, I guess that's about everything I have to talk about for orchids today then. I appreciate y'all coming.